6 years is a long time to be written off. The Conclave had filed humanity under declining non-member population in its quarterly reports, and moved on without looking back. Trade routes were redistributed to more cooperative species. Humanity's old diplomatic channels were reassigned. A Volari historian published a short paper suggesting that the expulsion would be studied by future generations as a case of successful deterrence. A clean example of the Conclave acting firmly before a disruptive species could become a genuine threat. The paper was well reviewed in academic circles. Several council members commended it. Nobody in the Conclave had actually sent a ship to check on things. 6 years after the crossing of the Veil Line, humanity was not declining, it was learning. The Reach Fleet, as Cole's loose coalition of military and civilian ships had come to be called, had charted over 300 star systems in the void reaches. Most were uninhabitable. Roughly 40 had usable resources: ice fields, mineral-dense moons, gas giants suitable for fuel harvesting. 8 had planets that could support life, some with modification, 1 or 2 without much effort at all. The gravitational anomalies that the Conclave had found so discouraging turned out, with time and careful study, to follow patterns. Not simple ones, not predictable in the way that well-mapped space was predictable, but patterns nonetheless. Amy Calloway had spent 3 years building a predictive model around them, refining it with every new transit. And by year 5, her team had reduced navigation incidents from a near-weekly event in year 1 to something that barely rated a mention in the weekly logs. They had also built Bastion. Bastion was a habitat cut into the core of the nickel-iron asteroid, roughly 4 kilometers in diameter. Located in a gravitationally stable pocket about 6 light-years inside the Veil Line. It had started as a temporary command post, a place to coordinate the fleet while more permanent settlements were established. Dana Ellison had turned it into something else entirely. She oversaw the installation of pressurized living quarters, a communications hub capable of monitoring signals from across the full operational range of the fleet, a council chamber, 2 hydroponics bays, and a well-stocked archive of every law, treaty, and historical record humanity had brought with them into the exile. Bastion was not elegant. It smelled like recycled air and machine grease, and the kind of instant coffee that only tasted acceptable when there was nothing else to drink. But it worked. And Dana had learned long ago that things which worked were worth considerably more than things which looked impressive. She ran the political side of the exile from Bastion. Not officially. There was no official structure yet, just a loose agreement among ship captains and colony administrators to defer to her judgment on matters that affected everyone. Dana managed that informally, which suited her. Formal authority attracted challenges from people who wanted the title. Informal authority just got things done. Owen Garrett had not been thinking about politics when he found the ruins. He had been thinking about fuel cells. He was 24 years old, a junior engineer on a salvage and survey vessel called the Grey Heron, and his assignment that week had been to assess a dense cluster of dead star remnants at the edge of a region his crew had labeled the Grey Shelf, named for the flat, dim light the dying stars cast over everything nearby. The Grey Shelf was considered low priority. The remnant cluster made navigation difficult, and the energy readings were inconsistent, which meant no easy resources and a lot of frustrating instrument noise. But the Grey Heron had an open schedule, and low-priority sectors still needed surveying. Someone had to do it. Owen had been running a standard passive scan when the anomaly appeared. Not a gravitational one, a structural one. The scan was returning solid geometric shapes from inside the largest of the stellar remnants, a dense, slow-cooling mass of collapsed star material, roughly the size of a small moon. Geometric shapes did not occur naturally inside collapsed stars. Owen ran the scan 3 more times to make sure he was not looking at sensor error. He was not. The shapes were real. They were deep inside the mass, surrounded by radiation levels that should have made them completely inaccessible. But they were real, and they were regular, and they had right angles. His captain told him to run the scan a fourth time. Owen did. Same result. The captain sat quietly at his station for a long moment, and then told Owen to contact Bastion. It took Cole 3 weeks to reach the Gray Shelf. He brought 2 science vessels with him. Dana arrived 4 days after Cole on a fast transport she had apparently boarded within hours of receiving the initial report, not waiting for an invitation. Owen met them both at the airlock of the Grey Heron and tried to explain what he had found in a calm, organized way. He managed about 4 sentences before Cole asked to see the raw scan data directly. Owen handed it over and watched the Admiral's face go very still in the particular way that, Owen would come to understand later, meant Cole was revising his understanding of the situation at high speed. They began excavation the following morning. It took 11 weeks to cut carefully through the outer material of the remnant and reach the first structure without damaging it. What they found inside was not a ship. It was not a weapon. It was not a simple power source, though it contained elements of all 3. It was a research facility, a complex partially intact, built from a material that resisted radiation and extreme temperature in ways that human metallurgy had never come close to achieving. The species that had built it had been gone for longer than humanity's entire recorded history. The Conclave had no record of them whatsoever. The structure contained no imagery, no biological remains, no markings that could identify what they had looked like or what they had called themselves. But it contained data. Vast amounts of data, encoded in a format that took Owen 6 more weeks of sustained work to even begin decoding. Around the same time, a Conclave patrol vessel crossed the Veil Line, not to negotiate, simply to observe. The patrol ship belonged to a species called the Vreth, known across Conclave space for their methodical nature and their talent for producing reliable intelligence reports. The ship spent 4 days monitoring the edges of human-occupied space from a careful distance, cataloged what it observed, and returned to Conclave territory to file its findings. The report describes scattered, disorganized settlements, inconsistent energy signatures suggesting unstable infrastructure, no signs of military buildup or coordinated governance. It concluded that the human population was managing basic survival, but showed no realistic potential for long-term expansion. Dana, who had maintained a quiet source inside the Vreth Communications Relay Network since her years as a Conclave ambassador, a contact she had never mentioned to anyone, received a copy of the report within a week of its filing. She sent a brief message thanking her contact, deleted the message from all logs, and went back to work. She did not correct the report. She had no interest in correcting it. Owen finished his first layer of decoding in the 43rd week after the initial discovery. He called Cole and Dana to the excavation site and showed them what he had found on a large display screen set up in the main analysis chamber, its walls still rough from the cutting equipment that had opened them. It was a map, not the partial hazard-filled chart of the void reaches that humanity had been building one dangerous transit at a time. This was a complete map. Hundreds of star systems, fully charted, with detailed resource notations, habitability assessments, atmospheric compositions, and something else layered on top of all of it. A network of stable transit paths, threading between the systems like veins through a body, not natural gravitational lanes. Corridors that had been built into the fabric of the void reaches by the ancient species, designed to last, and still functioning after tens of thousands of years, invisible to standard sensors because they operated on principles that no current civilization had ever thought to look for. The 3 of them stood in front of that map in silence for a long time. Outside the chamber, through the thick walls of the excavation site, the Gray Shelf's dead stars gave off their slow gray light. The void reaches was not a graveyard. It was not a punishment. It was an estate, fully mapped, fully built, waiting to be claimed, and the Conclave, in its certainty that the exile would finish humanity quietly, had handed them the keys. Cole looked at the map for a long time. Then, he looked at Amy Calloway's preliminary data on the corridor locations, cross-referenced it against the ancient chart, and asked how long before they could run the first test transit. Owen said 2 weeks, if they were careful. Cole said to be careful then, but to start tonight. Nobody named it an empire right away. That word carried weight, and the people doing the building were far too busy to argue about what to call what they were making. 12 years passed in the void reaches, the way hard years always pass. Fast when there was work to do, slow when there was something to worry about, and only truly understood in hindsight. Cole Hargrove had a saying he used with junior officers. You do not know what you have built until you step back and look at it. He had been saying it for so long that it had become a kind of running joke across the fleet. By year 12, nobody was laughing at it anymore. They were starting to understand exactly what he meant. The ancient transit corridors changed everything almost immediately. Once Owen Garrett's team had mapped the full network and confirmed the corridors were stable and usable, Cole authorized expansion in careful phases. The first phase focused on resource access, sending survey and mining teams along the safest corridor routes to reach systems that had previously required weeks of dangerous navigation. The second phase was permanent settlement. Colony ships that had been crowded into the systems nearest to Bastion were guided along the corridors to new worlds, some already hospitable, others requiring the patient terraforming work that humanity had, somewhat ironically, been expelled from the Conclave for doing in the first place. Nobody in the void reaches raised any objections. Cole managed the military and logistical side of it all from his flagship, now permanently docked at Bastion, since the ship's systems were more capable than anything the asteroid's original hardware could match. He was in his late 60s by this point, and moved a little more slowly than he used to, but his mind operated exactly as it always had, direct, patient, and completely impossible to rush. He had a particular gift for looking at a complicated situation and identifying the single thing that actually mattered before anyone else had finished arguing about the things that did not. In the early years of the expansion, that gift prevented the fleet from making a number of decisions that would have looked smart in the short term and caused serious damage later. He said no quite a lot. His people had learned that when Cole said no, the right response was to ask him why, rather than push back, because the why was always worth hearing. Dana Ellison's work was less visible than Cole's, but no less important. Running the political reality of a civilization that technically did not have a formal political structure yet required a specific kind of patience that Dana had spent years developing as a Conclave ambassador. The colony administrators trusted her. The ship captains trusted Cole. Those two facts, she understood clearly, were the load-bearing walls of everything they were doing. As long as that trust held, the whole structure functioned. The moment it cracked, they would have 100 groups pulling in 100 different directions, and the Conclave would not even need to act. The cracks began appearing around year 8. The older colonies, the ones established earliest, that had developed real infrastructure, real populations, real economies, started pushing for formal representation. They wanted votes on decisions, not consultation after the fact. They wanted control over their own resource allocations, not distributions approved from a central pool. A few colony administrators began holding their own councils, making agreements with neighboring settlements, and simply informing Bastion afterward, rather than asking permission beforehand. Dana handled each situation individually, carefully, without ever appearing to handle anything at all. She had long conversations with people. She made introductions between parties who did not know they had common interests. She reminded people of what they shared, before she allowed them to get to what they disagreed about. But the pressure kept building, and then Aaron Voss arrived. Aaron was 31 years old, a senator from the Kepler colonies, a cluster of 3 linked settlements on a pair of habitable worlds connected by the second transit corridor humanity had fully mapped. He was not loud, and he was not aggressive. He was methodical. He showed up to Dana's council meetings fully prepared, with written proposals, supporting data, and a calm, reasonable manner that made it very difficult to dismiss him, without appearing to dismiss the argument rather than the man. His core position was simple. A civilization of this size and complexity needed a real government. Not a coalition. Not a council of ship captains and colony administrators. A proper government with a constitution, a senate, a legal framework, and a clear chain of authority that everyone understood before they needed to use it. Dana agreed with him. She had always agreed with him. What she disagreed with was his timeline. She told him, in one of their many private conversations at Bastion, that a government formed too early becomes the government of whoever happened to be in the room when the rules were written. She said they needed more settlements properly represented before they locked anything in, because the people at the table, when the Constitution was drafted, would carry an advantage over everyone who arrived later. She asked him to give her 2 more years. He offered 18 months. She accepted, and they shook hands across the small table in her office, with the recycled air humming through the vents above them. Laura Kinsey complicated the timeline in the way that genuinely useful information always does. Laura had been a conclave liaison officer for a minor species called the Turath, before she defected to humanity at the time of the exile. She had not been idealistic about it. She had simply assessed her options clearly, and concluded that the species she technically worked for had no real power within the conclave, that the conclave was going to become more restrictive over time rather than less, and that humanity, exiled or not, represented a more interesting long-term prospect. She had been correct about all 3 assessments. She spent her years in the void reaches, maintaining her network of conclave contacts with patient care and waiting until she had something genuinely worth saying. In year 10, she brought her findings to Dana. The conclave was fracturing internally over the question of the void reaches. Several member species had begun to notice that their long-term resource projections showed shortfalls that could only be addressed by accessing new territory. The void reaches, which they had written off as unusable, was beginning to look more attractive from the outside, as their own accessible systems thinned out. Some conclave factions were arguing for a formal survey mission across the Veil Line. Others warned that provoking humanity, even exiled, nominally weakened humanity, was not worth the political cost. The internal argument had been going on for 4 years, Laura said. It would not go on forever. Dana passed the information to Cole the same day. Cole read it and said nothing for a long while. Then he told Dana to move the government timeline forward. She contacted Aaron Voss within the hour. Owen, during all of this, had barely left the gray shelf. His team had grown from 4 people to over 100, drawing researchers and engineers from across the fleet on rotating assignments. The ancient facility kept revealing new layers. Every system they decoded opened a door to another system. Every room they excavated raised new questions about the civilization that had built it. Owen published his findings in real time, sharing everything with the fleet's research community as it came in, rather than waiting for completed studies. It was not the way formal science was supposed to work, but it was the way this science had to work. There was simply no time for the slow and careful method. In year 11, he found the second structure. It was deeper inside the stellar remnant than any of the excavation teams had yet reached, sealed behind a door that used no mechanical system and no electronic code. It required a specific pattern of bioelectric output, a stress response, Owen eventually realized after weeks of careful analysis. The chamber had been designed to open for beings who were under pressure, beings who needed what was inside because they were running out of time. It was the most deliberate and unsettling design choice Owen had ever encountered in any structure built by any hand. What was inside was a message, written in the same base language as the rest of the facility's data, but different in tone. Not a record, not a technical document, but a direct address to whoever was reading it. Owen spent 3 months producing a reliable translation. When he had it, he called Cole and Dana to the Gray Shelf in person, rather than transmitting the content over open communication channels. He was not being dramatic. He simply did not want this conversation to exist in any log until the three of them had decided together what to do with it. Not about the conclave. About something else. Something that existed in the deepest part of the void reaches, far beyond any human-settled system, far beyond anything on any map they had found. The ancient species had given it no name. They had simply described what it did and why they had chosen to leave rather than face it. Owen had given it a name in his own notes. He called it the Unwritten. He thought that fit. Cole asked how urgent it was. Owen said the message gave no specific timeline. The ancient civilization had fled tens of thousands of years before. The Unwritten might not move quickly by any standard definition of the word, but it had moved before. And whatever had convinced an entire advanced civilization to abandon everything they had built had not ceased to exist simply because they left. The Constitutional Convention was held 3 months later on Ironhold, the cold, heavy-gravity world that had grown into the largest human settlement in the void reaches, with a population approaching 400,000, and a well-earned reputation for producing the kind of serious, practical people that a civilization building its first government needed around the table. Aaron Voss delivered the opening address. He kept it short. He said they had arrived here with nothing, that they had built something real from that nothing, and that the time had come to make sure what they had built was capable of lasting. He said the name he proposed, the Sovereignty of the Reach, was not about pride. It was a statement of observable fact. They had reached into an empty and hostile place and filled it with something that worked. That was what they were, and the name should say so plainly. The vote was unanimous. Dana, sitting in the third row of the assembly hall, did not applaud with the others. She allowed herself one small, quiet exhale, then opened her notebook and began writing down everything that needed to happen next. There was, as always, a great deal of it. The Conclave fleet crossed the Veil Line on a Tuesday, by the human calendar. 42 warships from 6 different species, moving in a loose formation that communicated confidence without quite committing to open aggression. The stated purpose, filed with the Conclave Oversight Committee in advance, was a resource survey and security assessment of the region directly adjacent to the boundary. The unstated purpose, which every officer in the fleet privately understood, was to find out how badly things had gone for the humans, and whether the void reaches might be worth claiming properly before another Conclave faction moved first. The fleet's commanding admiral was a Vreth named Soth Carroll. He was experienced, methodical, and had built his long career on careful operations that produced clean results with minimal complications. He had reviewed the intelligence reports from the patrol ship that had crossed the boundary years earlier. He had reviewed humanity's last known fleet disposition at the time of the exile. He had done his calculations and concluded, reasonably enough, that this mission would be straightforward. The first thing that went wrong was the transit corridor. The fleet's lead vessel dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the designated survey entry point and immediately lost navigational control. There was no collision, no explosion, and no visible cause of any kind. The ship simply stopped responding to its own helm, as though the space around it had developed a clear opinion about where it was going. The effect spread through the entire formation within seconds. Every ship in the fleet, was caught in something that moved them forward along a path that existed nowhere in their charts. Smoothly, without violence, at a speed that allowed no time to coordinate a response. Then it deposited them, still disoriented and with their system cycle, into a star system none of them had ever seen before. They were surrounded before their weapons came back online. They knew it was Ironhold because the name was clearly marked in large characters on the side of an orbital station that sat approximately 800 meters off the lead ship's port side. Around the fleet, filling every direction, were human ships. Not a handful, not a patrol, a full fleet. Warships, carriers, and support vessels arranged in a wide, patient formation that left no open exit vector and made the situation completely clear without a single weapon being aimed. The 8 minutes during which the Conclave fleet's systems were still cycling back to full operational readiness were, by all later accounts, the most uncomfortable 8 minutes of Soth Carroll's entire career. Cole Hargrove's voice came over the channel before the weapons finished cycling. It was unhurried. It was not the voice of a man who had spent 12 years being punished by the decision of a governing body he no longer recognized as having authority over him. Cole said that he understood the transit corridor must have been disorienting, and that he hoped no one aboard had been injured. He said that the sovereignty of the Reach considered the transit corridor network to be sovereign infrastructure, and that entering it without prior notification was something they would appreciate the Conclave avoiding going forward. He said the sovereignty had no interest in conflict. He offered safe passage out of the system and volunteered a navigational escort to guide the fleet back through the corridor network to the Veil Line without incident. He asked Soth Carroll, with what appeared to be genuine politeness, to pass a message to the full Conclave Assembly on his behalf. The message was brief. Next time, they should knock. Soth Carroll accepted the offer. He did not have many other options available to him. The Conclave fleet was escorted out over the following hours. Not a single shot was fired. No ship was boarded or searched. The human vessels held their formation throughout, and then withdrew cleanly as the corridor deposited the Conclave fleet safely beyond the Veil Line, back in familiar space. The whole operation had been managed with a level of professional courtesy that somehow made the entire thing more uncomfortable than a fight would have been. Laura Kinsey released the sensor footage within a week. She did not release it directly. She passed it through 3 carefully chosen intermediary contacts, each located in different Conclave member states, and let it spread naturally from there. She had selected her contacts with precision. Within 2 weeks, the footage had reached the full Conclave General Assembly, been broadcast on 11 separate news networks across Conclave space, and been discussed in heated and increasingly alarmed terms by politicians and military analysts who had until that moment genuinely believed that the void reaches contained a failing and disorganized population of exiles who posed no serious concern. The internal argument inside the Conclave transformed from a slow 4-year disagreement into a full political crisis in a matter of days. The factions that had been warning against provoking humanity suddenly had every piece of evidence they needed. The factions that had been pushing for a resource survey found themselves defending a mission that had produced nothing but embarrassment. The Conclave Assembly called 3 emergency sessions inside 2 weeks and resolved exactly nothing in any of them. Dana watched all of it from Bastion with quiet, private satisfaction. Then she got back to work. The 18 months that followed were tense in the particular grinding way that open conflict never quite manages to produce on its own. There were no major battles. There were border incidents along the Veil Line, probe ships that crossed briefly and retreated, communication signals that contained no clear message but were obviously not accidental, and one incident involving a Conclave mining vessel that drifted into a Reach-charted system and was escorted out by a sovereignty patrol with such excessive courtesy that the mining crew found the entire experience deeply unsettling. Aaron Voss, as Chancellor of the Sovereignty, handled the public side of things. He gave statements that were measured and firm without ever being threatening. He had a particular talent for saying things that sounded reasonable on the surface, and only revealed their full weight when you thought about them afterward. Dana had encouraged him to develop that quality deliberately, and she was satisfied with the results. Behind all of it, Dana was doing what she had always done best. She had identified the Conclave factions most likely to be genuinely interested in a negotiated relationship with the Sovereignty, and had begun establishing back-channel contact with each of them, carefully, slowly, without announcing what she was doing at any stage. Not formal talks, not official negotiations, conversations, questions and answers, and careful hypotheticals. She was building a detailed understanding of the Conclave's internal landscape, the same way Owen had built maps of the void reaches, which was to say patiently, in fine detail, and without telling anyone she was doing it until she had something solid enough to act on. Then Owen brought her the thing that changed the entire calculation. He had completed the full translation of the ancient warning. Not the summary he had shared with Cole and Dana before the Constitutional Convention, but the complete text, as accurate as 18 months of careful work by his full team could make it. He came to Bastion in person and spent 4 hours going through it with Cole and Dana, in a private room with no recording equipment and no aides present. When he finished, the room was very quiet for a long time. The unwritten was real and specific. The ancient species had been precise about its nature. Not a biological entity, not a weapon, not a natural phenomenon in any standard sense of those words. It was something that existed at the edge of what organized matter could be, and when it moved through a region of space, it did not destroy things the way weapons destroyed things. It changed them, slowly and in ways that were invisible at first, and irreversible once they became visible. The ancient civilization had detected the early signs and made the decision to leave, while leaving was still possible. They had built the message into the ruins because they believed something would eventually survive long enough in the void reaches to find it, and because they believed that something deserved to know what they had faced. Cole asked the question that mattered most. He asked whether knowing it was coming was enough to do anything useful about it. Owen said he honestly did not know, but he believed that not knowing was worse than knowing, and he believed that one civilization, however capable it might be, was not the right answer to something of this scale and nature. Cole sat with that for a long moment. Then he told Dana to go back across the veil line. Dana did not argue. She had been expecting it for some time. She asked only for enough preparation time, and Cole gave her 3 weeks. She arrived at the Conclave Assembly Hall on a clear morning, carrying a single data drive, and wearing a plain, simple suit that looked nothing like the formal diplomatic attire of her previous life as an ambassador. The chamber was exactly as she remembered it, enormous, shimmering, the pale blue haze still gathering at the top of the ceiling like it always had. But the energy in the room was different from the last time she had stood on that floor. 12 years ago, the Conclave had been certain. Now it was frightened, and doing a visible but imperfect job of concealing that fact. Dana placed the data drive on the speaker's podium. She looked up at the galleries. All 17 species, all watching her. She said they had not come back to argue about the past. She said they had come back because something was coming, and the Conclave needed to decide clearly and soon whose side it intended to be on. The chamber was silent enough that she could hear the ambient hum of the building's ventilation system. Good, she thought. Now they were listening. The moment elder races discovered humans had tamed apex predators as household pets for fun. Part 5. The formal diplomatic session resumed the following morning. The atmosphere in the hall was different from the day before. It was still serious. The conclave was still formal. The representatives still wore their robes and sat in their designated seats and observed the protocols that had governed these meetings for thousands of years. But something underneath all of that had shifted. It was small, and no one named it out loud, but Owen noticed it the moment he walked in. The officials looked at him differently, not with the polite condescension they had worn the day before, with something closer to curiosity. Even Breck Dower, the Kaelry security head who had stood against the wall with crossed arms the day before, gave Owen a nod when he sat down. It was brief and did not involve any warmth, but it was a nod. The agenda for the session was the formal presentation of humanity's cultural history, which Nora had prepared with great care over several months. It was supposed to have been the centerpiece of the first meeting. Instead, it was happening on the second day, after 3 animals had thoroughly disrupted the expected program. Nora presented it with her usual calm energy. She talked about early human civilizations, about art and language and agriculture. She talked about the long, difficult history of a species that had spent most of its existence fighting, and had somehow, gradually, built something that cared about peace. The delegates listened. The Solani had questions about human social structures. The Vreth had questions about human governance. Voss Ren, the Kaelry delegate, surprised everyone by asking a thoughtful question about the human concept of family, and whether it extended to non-human members of a household. Nora said yes, for most humans, without hesitation. She said that for many people alive today, the loss of a pet was one of the most painful experiences of their lives. Voss Ren processed that for a moment. He said that his species had never domesticated any animal. He said that on his homeworld, the relationship between predator and prey had always been defined by distance and survival. He said he had never considered that there might be a third option. Nora said that the third option was a lot of work. She said it had taken thousands of years and countless generations of both species choosing, over and over, to stay close. She said it was probably the longest relationship in human history, and that most people would say it was worth it. Owen then gave the history of working animals. He talked about dogs that helped shepherds, dogs trained to find people buried under rubble after disasters, dogs that sat beside soldiers in foxholes and kept them from going out of their minds with fear and loneliness. He talked about horses that had carried humans across continents. He talked about the very recent development of therapy animals, creatures brought into hospitals and schools and disaster sites specifically to provide comfort to people who were suffering. The Solani delegate, a composed and quiet individual named Resalai, asked how long it had taken humanity to develop this practice of using animals for emotional support. Owen said it had not been developed exactly. He said it had been noticed. Someone had seen that animals helped people feel less alone, and had decided to make that official. He said humans were often good at noticing things that worked, and then finding ways to use them more. Resalai said that the Solani had been a spacefaring civilization for 12,000 years. Owen said he was aware. Resalai said that in 12,000 years, the Solani had never once brought a creature from their homeworld aboard a diplomatic vessel because it made people feel better. Owen said he found that a little sad, honestly, and then immediately wondered if he should have said that out loud. Resalai looked at him for a moment, and then made a sound that his translator rendered as something close to a quiet laugh. It was apparently not taken as an insult. The morning went on. The presentations continued. Lou was not in the room. Viscid and Deputy were also back on the ship, but they were present in the conversation in a way that was hard to ignore. The animals had changed the shape of the meeting. Things that might have been said with careful diplomatic distance were being said a little more directly. Questions that might have taken weeks of formal exchange to arrive at were being asked on the second day. At the end of the session, the conclave prepared to hold the formal vote on humanity's admission to the interstellar community. It was supposed to have happened on day 1, but had been delayed by the events of the Manifest Review. Now, it was here. Each delegate was given the opportunity to speak before the vote was recorded. Sul Arak spoke first. He spoke about humanity's youth as a civilization, about the promise and uncertainty that came with welcoming any new species. He said that the conclave had been built on the belief that cooperation was more powerful than isolation. He said that the humans had arrived with energy and warmth, and a habit of doing things in unexpected ways. He said he believed they would be a valuable addition. He said this in the formal, measured language of Vreth diplomacy. But Owen heard something genuine beneath it. Resalai spoke about the human relationship with animals at length. She said it had given her conclave delegation more information about human psychology than any document or presentation could have. She said that a species that chooses to love what it could fear is a species she was interested in understanding better. Voss Ren said very little. He said that he had revised his initial security assessment and that he no longer considered the animals a threat. He said this without apology because Kael'ri officials never apologize, but there was something in the way he said it that Owen took as the closest thing he was going to get to one. The Duran elder was last. He stood, which he rarely did in conclave meetings. Owen had been told, quietly, that the elder had not stood to give a closing statement in over 400 years. The room went very still. He spoke slowly, with long pauses between sentences. He said that in 9,000 years, he had learned to be careful about hope. He said that young civilizations often arrived with great energy and then lost it. He said that what he looked for when a new species came before the conclave was not strength or intelligence. He said every species that made it to the stars had enough of both. What he looked for was something harder to name. He said he believed he had seen it the day before in that lounge. He said that a species that tames an apex predator not through chains or fear or scientific control, but through patience and affection, and 15,000 years of simply choosing to be kind to something that could hurt them. That species had something in it that he did not see often enough. He said it was a kind of courage that did not look like courage at first. It looked like a dog asleep with its legs in the air. It looked like a cat deciding to trust a stranger. It looked like a small animal stealing a ceremonial pin, and everyone in the room laughing instead of escalating. He said that he had lived long enough to know that the civilizations that lasted were not always the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones that knew how to be soft in the right moments, that knew when to lower their guard, that had practiced, for a very long time, the habit of choosing trust over fear. He said he was voting yes. The vote was unanimous. Carter found out about the result when Owen came back to the ship and told him. Carter was sitting on the floor of the cargo bay again, Biscuit pressed against his side, Deputy asleep in the crook of his elbow, Lou stretched across his legs like a long gray blanket. He looked up when Owen came in. Owen told him the news. Carter smiled slowly and looked down at the three animals. He scratched Biscuit behind the ear. Biscuit thumped his tail once against the floor, without opening his eyes. Later that evening, the conclave's official record office filed the documentation of humanity's entry into the interstellar community. The record noted the date, the vote count, and the names of the attending delegates. It noted the cultural exchange items brought by each civilization. The Vreth entry listed their crystalline instrument. The Kael'ri entry listed their stone tablet. The human entry listed, in careful official language, 3 non-sapient companion animals of apex predator lineage, brought voluntarily for the purpose of diplomacy. In the margin of the entry, filed under personal annotations of the senior Duran representative, they were written in the Elder's own language, which translated into a very old form of galactic standard, that most current officials needed an archival dictionary to read. It said simply and without further explanation, "Watch these ones carefully." The archivist who processed the record later that night noted the annotation and logged it without comment. They had learned over many years that when the elder wrote something down, it was worth keeping. Somewhere in Cargo Bay 3, Biscuit stretched in his sleep, tail twitching once. Deputy had found a new corner he liked better and was busy arranging it. Lou was on her shelf, eyes half open in the dim light, watching the door with the patient, unhurried attention of something that knew it had already won. Outside the ship, Vega Station hummed quietly in the dark, between stars. The galaxy had just gotten a little wider. The hall was enormous, bigger than any building humanity had ever constructed. The ceiling stretched so high that the upper sections disappeared into a pale blue haze. The walls were carved from a stone that no human geologist had ever named, and they shimmered faintly with slow, shifting patterns of light, like a heartbeat made visible. 17 alien species sat in tiered galleries that curved around a central floor in a perfect circle, and every single one of them was looking down at the two humans standing in the middle of it all. Admiral Cole Hargrove did not look up at them. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and stared straight ahead at the speaker's platform, where a tall, gray-skinned being called a Valari read from a long, translucent scroll. Cole had been standing for 3 hours. He did not let it show. Beside him, Ambassador Dana Ellison had her arms crossed and her jaw set in the particular way she had when she was angry, but thinking too fast to let the anger out. She was shorter than Cole by nearly a foot, with close-cut dark hair and eyes that never seemed to stop moving. She had been translating the proceedings into the human diplomatic feed under her breath, not because anyone asked her to, but because she wanted every word on record in a human voice. The charges were being read for the 3rd time. That was procedure in the conclave. 3 readings, so there could be no claim of misunderstanding later. Unauthorized terraforming of 3 protected worlds in the Oran Belt. Reverse engineering of Valari drive technology, recovered from a derelict vessel. Refusal to comply with the conclave disarmament directive of the previous year, which had required all non-member deep space warships to be decommissioned and handed over for inspection. Cole had refused that last one personally. He had sent the conclave a politely worded document explaining that no navy in human history had ever voluntarily surrendered its warships to a foreign power, and that humanity did not intend to begin that tradition today. The document had been considered a provocation. The trial had followed shortly after. The verdict, when it finally came, was read by the speaker in a flat, practiced voice. Expulsion from the Galactic Conclave. Termination of all trade agreements and diplomatic relations. Revocation of access to all Conclave-controlled transit lanes and fueling stations. A boundary line, referred to in the official record as the Veil Line, was to be established at the outer edge of charted space. Humanity had 90 standard days to move all ships, stations, and colonies behind it. Any human vessel found inside the boundary after that date would be seized or destroyed without warning. And beyond the Veil Line, nothing. The Conclave had a name for the region past the boundary, the Void Reaches, and that name had been chosen carefully. It was not charted, not colonized, and not safe. Gravitational fields that behaved in ways no standard physics model could fully explain. Dead zones where faster-than-light drives simply failed mid-transit. Collapsed star systems and drifting debris clouds large enough to swallow entire fleets whole. The Conclave had explored its edges a century earlier, found it unlivable, and walked away from it. The message behind the sentence was not subtle. The Void Reaches would finish what the Conclave had started. Dana's translation continued in a steady, calm voice, even as her jaw tightened further with every sentence. When the reading ended, she waited for the chamber to go quiet. Then she spoke aloud, not to translate, but to address the gallery directly. She said that humanity acknowledged the ruling, that it disputed every charge on the record, and that it would comply with the terms of the boundary, not out of agreement, but out of practicality. She said that the conclave had made a significant mistake, and that it would come to understand that in time. Then she turned around and walked toward the exit without waiting to be dismissed. Cole followed her. He did not hurry. He walked the way he always walked, like a man who had decided where he was going and saw no reason to prove it to anyone. Outside the hall, in the wide, climate-controlled corridor that led back to the human diplomatic bay, the two of them said nothing for a long time. A junior aide from Dana's staff fell into step behind them and started to speak. But Dana raised one finger without turning around, and the aide went silent. It was Cole who finally spoke first. He said that 90 days was enough time. Dana asked him what he meant. He said enough time to choose what they were taking with them. Not just ships and people. Priorities. What mattered and what did not. Dana looked at him sideways. She asked if he was already thinking about going back someday. Cole said he was thinking about not needing to. He said there was a difference between the two. The fleet assembled over the following weeks. It was not a small fleet. Humanity had 53 colony ships, 19 military escorts, 8 deep-range science vessels, and a scattering of independent civilian haulers who had heard the news and decided they would rather follow the fleet into the dark than stay behind in a galaxy that had just voted them out. They came in ones and twos, docking at the outer staging point beyond the Oran Belt, running system checks, loading supplies, and talking in low voices about what came next. Nobody had good answers. Most people had questions they were afraid to ask out loud. On the 88th day, the fleet crossed the Veil Line. Cole stood on the bridge of his flagship, a heavy military vessel called the Resolute, and watched the sensor display as the boundary marker, a chain of automated conclave buoys blinking in slow red pulses, slid past on the rear camera feed. Around him, his bridge crew worked quietly. Most of them were young. Some had families on the colony ships trailing behind them in the dark. None of them said anything dramatic. There was nothing dramatic to say. They had been expelled from the only political structure humanity had ever joined, and now they were flying into a region of space that every known civilization had agreed was not worth entering. The situation spoke clearly enough on its own. Amy Calloway, his navigation officer, had her eyes fixed on the forward display. She was 29 years old and had been Cole's preferred navigator for 2 years because she was the kind of person who thought about 6 things at once and still hit her entry windows on the first pass every time. She pulled up a preliminary sensor sweep of the region ahead, a slow, expanding cone of data points, most of them gray, most of them labeled unknown. Cole studied it in silence for a moment. Then he said her name. She looked up. He told her to plot them a course deeper in, not toward the edges of the void reaches, where the conclave had already explored and turned back. Deeper, into the parts nobody had ever bothered to look at. She held his gaze for a second. Then she turned back to her console and started working. She had worked with Cole long enough to understand that when he said deeper, he had already decided there was something worth finding. They just had not found it yet. The fleet moved forward into the dark. The conclave buoys disappeared behind them. The stars ahead were unfamiliar and densely packed, arranged in patterns that matched nothing in any standard chart humanity carried. The void reaches closed in around them, and the galaxy behind them kept turning without pause, without hesitation, as though nothing of any importance had just happened. It had no idea what it had just let go.